This presentation is being recorded today. We've got a brand new website, so some people are having a little bit of an issue finding some of our recorded webinars. So to find this recorded webinar later on, if you come up to our website, cad-1.com, and go to Learn, you will see right here our CAD1 video channel, which will have our recorded webinars. We've also got a YouTube channel in here. And you'll also see links to our constantly running webinars, the ones that aren't recorded, Revit Radio, AutoCAD Answers, and Civil Chat. These are more like the questions and answers forum, the car chat, or the car facts, whatever was it, car talk? Car talk. Car talk version of our webinars where you just ask questions and we get around to answering them. On our website, we will shortly have links underneath webinars for all future webinars, but right now everybody's getting their emails, and it looks like we've got a pretty good group of people joining us today. There's not going to be, honestly, a lot of PowerPoint in this. Yay! We're all very happy about that. Questions, as I mentioned, are welcome, and that's just about our last PowerPoint slide. So what are we here to talk about today? Well, we're here to talk about AutoCAD annotation scaling. Hopefully everybody who's using AutoCAD knows what AutoCAD annotation is. Now, AutoCAD annotation can take on a lot of different meanings. And annotation is basically text, dimensions, hatch patterns, line types, and even to some extent blocks can be considered annotation. Symbols representing things like switches, electrical outlets, things like that, manholes, things that don't necessarily represent a real-world object in real-world units, but they do represent real-world objects, just as symbology. So annotation scaling, what is that all about? Well, it was introduced back in AutoCAD 2008, and annotative scaling was geared to relieve a problem that we had had for many, many, many years in AutoCAD drafting. And specifically, I'm showing that on my screen right now. The issue that we used to have was when I plug in annotation, and a lot of people, when they were doing their design, skip back over to model space, when they were doing their design, they would annotate things in model space. And that makes sense. You want to put in model space things that have to do with your model, and that's what we always tell people. So we would put room names, room numbers, hatching, dimensioning, and all of that inside of model space. Well, the problem rises when we flip on over to our new layout tabs in our paper space and we set up multiple viewports for printing our drawing. And the multiple viewports, now everybody has been using different scales for the multiple viewports, different plot scales. So when I set up a viewport inside of my paper space layout, then down at the bottom of my screen, I can set up a viewport scale. So you'll notice this viewport up at the top left is 1/4 inch equals a foot. That's how I want it scaled. The one that I'm going to switch to at the top right, 3/8 inch. Below that, 3/4 of an inch. And to the left of that, 1/2 inch equals a foot. So we've got all different scales that I want to print my drawing out at. Now that's been around for a number of years and people really like that. The problem arises is if where I'm putting in annotation, and as you see, the annotation is coming in, but it's not coming in the same size. Now, construction documentation, this is a huge no-no. Now, if you're just doing a banner for your office, a happy birthday banner, or something else, some kind of documentation that you're not submitting to anybody, however your annotation looks is fine, as long as it's legible. It doesn't matter whether it's a 1/4 of an inch high or 3 inches high. As long as it's legible and I can see it, I'm good to go. However, having said that, if you conform to the architectural graphic standards of drafting, if you're submitting this to an approving agency, if this is a construction document of any kind, then what you see in front of you is a no-no. I've got text of all different sizes in here. Now, all of my annotation is supposed to conform to just one size. How we dealt with this in the past was, well, we had a few different ways, actually. One method was we would put our annotation, we would put our text on top of the viewport, drawing in a little piece of text there. Now, the problem with that is that if I were to move the viewport or do anything else or erase the viewport, the text doesn't move with it. The text isn't attached to the model like it should be. That text is calling out a model object. It should be inside model space. So that was one method. Not a great method of taking care of things because I'd have to annotate multiple different viewports in multiple different layouts. So I'm doing multiple pieces of annotation. At least I don't have to worry about the size of the annotation, but I am still doing multiple pieces of annotation, and I've got to switch back and forth from drawing to drawing, from layout to layout to manage all of this text. Well, the second method that people would use was they would have a piece of text such as this loan officer up here at the top left. And in order to get it to show up appropriately, they would need to scale this text for a specific height. They would need to make that text a specific height so that when I printed the drawing at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, that text would come out properly inside of my viewport. Well, when I came over to other scale viewports, what do? Historically, what we would do is we would copy that piece of text, put it on a separate layer, scale the piece of text for the new viewport, and then on a viewport by viewport basis, I would have to come up to my layers and I would have to use that other icon over there to freeze and thaw different layers of text inside of different viewports. So effectively, I've got all of my annotation in one location. It's in model space, but I've still got multiple pieces of annotation and multiple sizes. So what if the loan officer moved and I was going to put the vice president there? Well, I'd have to thaw all of those layers. I would have to go in and I'd have to edit multiple pieces of text all at once. So I've kind of got a similar problem to my first answer. So these were how we used to solve these problems. How are we solving them now? Well, now, starting with AutoCAD 2008, we have got what's called annotative scaling for all of our annotation. And by all of our annotation, I mean what I'm showing you can be done for your multi-line text, single-line text, dimensions, multi-leaders, hatch patterns, and even blocks, so that when you insert a block, it'll automatically scale. Now, what does this do? What annotative scaling does is it allows me to put in one piece of text and have that text automatically set itself up as a printed height. I'm not worried about scaling. I'm not worried about saying, oh, this piece of text right here needs to be 12 inches high in order to print at a certain scale. No, I'm going to tell the program I want that piece of text to print at 1/4 of an inch high. And I don't care how many viewports I have. I don't care how many layouts I have or drawings I have. I want that piece of text to print at 1/4 of an inch high. So what we do with annotative scaling is we tell the program to automatically self-scale all of our annotation for us. Now, you all have seen a little bit of this if you've been using Paperspace for years. I'll come over to my B-size layout, and as I've already mentioned, these two viewports on the top are two different scales. Now, if you look at the tellers area, you'll notice that the tellers area has been denoted with a hidden line type. Now, the annotative scaling comes in the fact that since I've got two different viewport scales and the hidden line type, I want this line type to look exactly the same in both viewports. And as you notice, it is. And that's being controlled through a system variable called PSLT scale. As long as your Paperspace line type scaling is turned on or set to 1 in Paperspace, all of your line types are automatically going to self-scale in each one of your viewports so that your line types look exactly alike. Now, in order for this to work, you need your LT scale, your line type scaling, to also, you need to have that set to 1 as well, so that the line type scale is setting to 1. I'm printing out of Paperspace in a 1-to-1, so all of my line types will look exactly the same and look appropriate for printing. Now, to help out with this, just as a quick aside before I get into all the annotative scaling, how come you can't see those dashed lines inside of my model space? Well, as I said a second ago, your line type scaling is set to 1. That means I've got 1/8 inch dashes in this great big drawing and 1/4 inch spaces, and I have to zoom in way, way, way close in order to see them. So in order to take care of that, at about the same time that Autodesk came up with the great idea of annotative scaling, they came up with a third system variable called MSLT scale. As long as MSLT scale is set to 1, When I regenerate my drawing, I can see my line types based on the scale factor that I'm going to print to. Now, how is that controlled in model space? In paper space, we set it on a viewport by viewport basis. In model space, you do the same thing fundamentally. I've got one model space viewport, and I set my plot scale down here in the ribbon, about the same spot that you would set it in paper space. So this is where I would control how I think I'm going to print it or how I want to see my line types. Now this is important because this scale factor is going to get applied to all of my annotation here in a moment. The line types are the first part. The line types are very, very easy, and I can set the line types up and change those. What about the text? What about the dimensions? Well, your first step is to set up an annotative scaled line or text style or dimension style or leader style. Setting them up is fundamentally the same, and to help you out, starting with 2008, Autodesk has included a free text style and dimension style and leader style called Annotative to help you out. So you could use that, you could start with it. I've never been one to really enjoy using stuff that comes right out of the box. I'm worried that somebody else is going to get in there and play around with that one. So you can create a brand new one. The trick to creating an annotative style is to make sure that you check the box that says annotative to let the program know that this is an annotative style. The second trick, this is very important, the second trick is right here. It's telling the program how high you want this text to print on a sheet of paper. We're not doing any math here, everyone. We are not multiplying this against the viewport scale. We already spent X number $1,000 for the program and several more $1,000 for the computer. We're going to have the computer do all of that math for us, and we're going to have it do it automatically. All we want to worry about is how high do we want this to print. Now, you've got a couple of other really neat options. One of the cool things with annotative scaling is this little option right here that says, do you want to match the text orientation to the layout? That means if you rotate your viewport, do you want the text to rotate itself back so that it always stays oriented with that layout? And that's a pretty cool option. Very similar to the way that Civil 3D annotation works for those of you out there using Civil 3D. But it's a pretty cool little feature. So the first thing that we need to do with all of our annotative styles, text, dimensions, leaders, etc., we need to set up an annotative style. It doesn't matter what the font you use, doesn't matter the font style or any other special effects that you want to use. We just need to make sure that we tell the program that we want it annotative and how big we want this object to print. After that, we just start annotating the drawing. Now, the key thing here when you're annotating the drawing is you've got to make sure that you set up an appropriate scale factor before you start annotating, because the annotation that you're drawing is going to come in at whatever scale factor that you've got applied down here. The default option inside of model space for all your scale factors in a normal drawing is 1:1 right out of the box, which means if I start drawing text right now, well, you can't see it. You can see it as I type it, but as soon as I get done typing, it just went away. Why did it? Well, it didn't go away. It's still there. It's just really, really, really tiny. Why? I told the program I want this to print out at 1/8 of an inch, and I'm specifying that I'm going to print this drawing at 1:1. We're not going to print drawings at 1:1. So how do I fix this? Well, there's a couple of ways to fix annotation inside your current drawing. Method number one is you get to use the AutoCAD Properties window, which I've got anchored over on the left-hand side of my screen. If I grab text inside my drawing and I come over to the Properties window, the program is going to be telling me, pull this out a little bit, that yes, it is in fact annotative. It's using an annotative style, but the only scale that I want applied is this 1:1 scale. Well, maybe I want other scales. I want it to print at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot and 3/8 of an inch equals a foot, not just 1:1. I want other scales. So this is one method of doing it globally. If I come over to click that little annotated scale, you'll notice I've got an add button where I can add any number of scales that I want. So I can come over here and grab all of these and add any scales that I want, add those in here, and now it'll print at 1/4 of an inch at that scale factor. Another method that you can use is the auto scaling tool. Whoops. Auto scaling tool down here at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a couple of extra icons. The first icon says show annotative objects always. That means if this is annotative, I want to be able to see it even if it does not conform to the current scale factor. Now what that means is that you'll remember that I've got this set up at 1:1 and 128th. So if I do not have this turned on, we turn that off. If I come over here and I change my scale to say 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, that annotation will disappear. So the other trick with annotative scaling for everybody that you just saw was that the annotation will only show up in a viewport in an appropriate scale factor that you've already added into your annotation. Now, what if I want to see that annotation regardless? Okay, so maybe I don't have it set up to print appropriately at 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, but I still want to see it. That's what this first icon is for. I turn that on, and it's going to show me that text at any scale factor. It's not going to scale it for me, but it will show it to me at any one of those scale factors. Okay. So now another thing that you can do is the second button over will automatically add a scale as I change it. So rather than grabbing that piece of text and going to the properties window and adding the scales manually on a text-by-text basis, I can go ahead and turn on the automatically add annotation scales. And as I change my annotation scale in model space, the program will automatically add that. Let me zoom in a little bit here. The program will automatically add those scale factors as I'm coming through here. So I change my scale, and it automatically adds that scale factor to all of my annotations. Now, the good news about that is that I don't need to worry about finding all of my text, going into the properties window and manually adding all of these. All I've got to do is just switch it. The bad news is that I've got to switch it to every one of my scale factors that I'm applying. However, if I'm doing this in paper space, I can go ahead and open up each one of my paper space viewports, reset the scale, and it'll automatically add that annotation scale. Okay, so a couple of different methods. I'll get to that, what you just saw there in a second. A couple of different methods of adding those annotated scales. Now, what some people do is they just get lazy, like me. It's not really lazy, I call it efficiency. And they'll grab all of their text, and they'll come over to the properties window, and they'll specify all the annotative scales all at once. Okay, pretty straightforward, easy to do. That's pretty cool, it's pretty easy to do, and there's another reason that I like doing this. That's the method that I use to add an annotative scale to objects that aren't annotative already. If I go ahead and grab this piece of text, I can come up here and I can choose the annotative scale or the annotative style that I want to use. As soon as I add the annotative style that I want to use, it will take on all of the attributes, the height, etc., based on my, based on my current scale factor. So how do I grab them all and how do I change them all? Well, if I just grab everything and say select similar, it grabs all of my text. I can use my properties window. As you'll notice, I can change the style, change it to annotative, make sure that it's set to annotative. Okay, make sure that everybody is taken care of. However, if I want to add, let me go ahead and select similar again. If I want to add all of those annotative scales, you'll notice that it's only got my current scale added in there. So now that I've got all my text added, I can use my properties window, click add, and because I'm being lazy or efficient, depending on how you want to put it, I'm going to grab all of my scale factors, hit OK, and now that text will print at 1/4 of an inch high regardless of which architectural scale that I decide to pick. This includes all of my viewports. So when I switch over to my layout tab, I've now fixed all of my annotation. Now I'm not going to do this again for dimensions or liters. It's fundamentally the same thing. You set up the style, you apply the style. Every new piece of text that you plug in will have that annotative scaling built in. And as you notice, all of my text is ready to print at 1/4 of an inch high in every one of these viewports. Now, another thing that people often ask is, well, if I put in a brand new piece of text right now, that's great. It'll be in that style, it'll be annotative, and it's only going to be annotated for the current scale factor. So is there a way to easily add all of those scales to a brand new piece of text? Now, honestly, not really. What can you do? Cheat. Copy an existing piece of text. Come on. Grab that guy. Copy an existing piece of text and then edit it. So now that piece of text has it all added in. Now, what's going on here? Well, the program, in its infinite wisdom, now that I've told the program that I've added in all these scale factors, the program is showing me what each one of those scale factors is going to look like as soon as I select that object. You'll notice that when I hover over an annotative object, I get the little glyph or the little icon next to my crosshairs that's letting me know that it is an annotative object, that it does have multiple scales. As soon as I grab that annotative object, the program is going to show me what all of those scales are going to be looking like. This will drive you crazy in short order because you can't see anything. As a matter of fact, if I do a crossing window and grab everything in my drawing, realistically, I can't see a thing. So how do we take care of that? Very easy. There's a system variable called selection anno display. Now, for those of you using a later version of the software, and a quick aside right now, you will notice that I'm using AutoCAD 2017, just released a few days ago. So for those of you using a later version of the software, 14, 15, 16, or even 17, you've got this selection anno display. And this system variable has been around for a while, but I'm not a very good typer. So what I wind up doing is I wind up mistyping things or not seeing what I'm typing in. So I love the autocomplete. That's something that I've got turned on all the time with autocorrect. So the system variable that we're looking at here is called selection anno display. If you set that to 0, then that means that when you grab an annotative object, it's only going to show you the grips and only show you the ghosting for the current scale factor. So out of this, if I want to see in model space what my drawing is going to look like if I printed it 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, I merely set 1/8 of an inch equals a foot for the scale factor. Since I've got the icon turned on to automatically add annotation scales, if I don't already have that annotation scale added to all my annotations, then it'll plug it in there for me and it'll show it to me. Now this other icon, as I was mentioning, just says show all of my annotation objects always, regardless of the scale factor. That's one that's really up to you. Annotation scales, adding different annotation scales, saying that I want to see something at a certain scale and I don't want to see something at a different scale, that could become very time consuming. So by having that third button turned on, that could confuse things. So if you get into annotative scaling and you really want to start taking this to the next level, where I'm turning off different annotation in different viewports based on the scale factor, then you probably want to disable this. Otherwise, you might want to have that turned on. And as I mentioned, when I get this set up, everything will be set up appropriately. Now, the last thing about annotative scaling that I do want to mention is, and you've got to be very careful with this, one of the reasons that the program will show you the ghosting, as I showed you a moment ago, that annotation display, that selection anno display, one of the reasons the program will show you that kind of ghosting is because every one of your scales, every one of your scale factors for each piece of annotation has its own grip. While this word, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Always lock your viewports. There. I'll zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to reach over here and I'll highlight the word lobby. Now you'll notice in this current viewport, and the one right above it, the word lobby highlights. It's only one word. If I want to change it, I double click it, I edit lobby and call it entrance or whatever else I want to. It's only one word. But here's where things get really crazy inside of annotative scaling. Even though it's only one word, each scale factor has its own grip. And what that means is that I can grab the grip for this particular scale factor at the bottom. I can move this piece of text, and it will be moved separately than in the other viewport. It's still only one piece of text, everybody, but you can move it separately. So in this particular scale, which is 3/4 of an inch equals a foot, that word is over here. But in this particular scale, which is 3/8 of an inch equals a foot, that word is still over there. So each annotative object has its own grip in each scale factor. You do need to be aware of that, because what if I wanted to copy the word lobby over to this lobby, as I was mentioning a moment ago? I want to have two words and I don't want to have to add in all the annotative scales, and I just want to plug it in. Well, if I copy it over, I'm also copying the new location inside that scale factor. So if you're going to get into this in advanced mode and start grip editing your objects, just be very careful. When you copy them, you're copying also where you've moved them to on a scale factor by scale factor basis. All right. Now I'm looking up here, and do we have any questions, Lawrence?
We have a couple questions that did just come in. Karen had asked, will matchprop work for text additions?
Oh, I see what you're saying. You know what? I've never actually tried that. So the question is will match properties work? So as you notice here, I just plugged in one new piece of text, and it's only got the scale factor for 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, which is my current scale factor that I've got. Now, how can I tell it's only got one scale factor applied? I've only got one of those little scale icons on there. If I hover over one of the other objects inside my drawing, you'll notice that I've got multiple. That means multiple on there. So the question was, can I use my AutoCAD match properties to match all those scale factors? If I grab one piece of text and I paint it to the other one, then the answer is yes. I kind of figured it would, but I've never really tried that. Then the answer is yes. It did add in all of those scale factors, so that was a very good question.
Next question is, does adding all scales to your text setup do anything to the file size?
Anything? Yes. It probably makes the file size a couple of kilobytes bigger. As far as huge size, I'm going to say the answer to that is no. Annotative scales for objects don't appreciably add any file size to the drawing. Like I said, maybe a couple kilobytes, nothing that you're ever really going to see. It doesn't like turn a 1 meg drawing into a 2 meg drawing or anything else like that.
Okay, and next question here is, do annotative objects work with XREFs?
That's another very good question. And the short answer and the quick answer to that is yes. Annotative objects do work across XREFs, so this is something that you need to be aware of. If I set this drawing up to be annotative, when I bring this drawing into another file, then that file or the XREF will react the same way. Now, another thing to be aware of, if you're dealing with people that are using a pre-2008 release, they didn't have annotative scaling. So if you're having to do a save as, and somebody says, hey, we're not using that version, we're using an AutoCAD 2007 or an AutoCAD 2004, heaven help you, even earlier than that, or an AutoCAD release 14 for DOS because my computer never died. So if we're using a much earlier version prior to annotative scaling coming out, what the program is set up to do automatically is it will maintain the visual fidelity of annotative objects. And that is in your AutoCAD options. So in my AutoCAD options for save as, I've got an option here. It says maintain visual fidelity for annotative objects. What does that mean? Well, that means if I do a save as and save it backwards too far, if the version of the program didn't have annotative scaling, then how's it going to fix it? Well, what it does is it reverts the drawing back to my second option of how we used to do things back in the old days. It will take every annotative object, it will convert it to different layers based on the actual layer name for this object. So if this is on the layer called text, then it's going to create another layer called text 1/8 and text 1/4 and text 1/32 and text, etc. It's going to self-scale all of those text objects based on 1/4 of an inch times the scale factor, and it's going to put each one of those on the appropriate layer. It will then, in any paper space viewport, freeze and thaw the opposite layers inside the viewport. So it goes back to the old way of doing things, but it does it for you automatically. Now, if you were to take that drawing and open it in a newer version of the software, it'll automatically recompile everything and put it all back on one layer and turn it into an annotative object again. So that's pretty cool.
One more question just came in here. Does the leader follow when you grip edit text at different scales?
If it's a annotative M leader, annotative M leaders act the same way as the text. So the whole leader object becomes an annotative object. So the whole thing and any of the grips will react the same way as the text that I was just showing you. So yes, everything that you're doing in any annotative object, multi-line text, dimensions, multi-leaders, they'll all act the same way, and the entire thing will be set up as an annotative object similar to the piece of text. Now, the big difference here being things like dimensions. While the dimension will act annotative, you've always got to remember, and I need to set up my annotative style. You've always got to remember for things like dimensions that whoops, let me try that again. Set that to an annotative style, and there we go. So for the dimension, while all of these objects will be annotative based on my annotative scale, and when we're talking about the grip editing, we're talking about the grips for the annotation. We are not talking about the definition point grips. You don't want to mess with the definition point grips of any dimension. So leave those alone. You're just going to want to mess with the arrowhead or the actual dimension text grips. And never mess with the definition points. Okay. All right, we are running out of time here, so I'm going to be wrapping up. Are there any other questions that people have before we start wrapping up here?
Yeah, back to you were discussing annotative objects working with XREFs. We had another question come in: does this apply to DIMS dimensions also?
Yes, as I was just mentioning, annotative scaling applies to multi-line text, dimensions, multi-leaders, blocks, and even hatch patterns, by the way. So and one of the things that people need to watch out about hatch patterns, I'm going to set the hatching layer current. I'm going to start the hatch command. Okay, and you'll notice that the hatch command looks really, really, really dense. Why? Because it's scaling it based on a 1-to-1 scale factor. So what I have to do while I'm hatching is I have to set the hatch to be annotative so that now it will go ahead and scale itself appropriately to whatever my scale factor is. And then as long as I add in, just like before, if I want to come in here and add in all the different annotative scales, then the hatch pattern will look exactly the same in every one of my viewports that I've got scaled.
Another question just came in: do annotative objects behave in all flavors of AutoCAD, such as Civil 3D?
Hey, great question right there. Annotative objects in here will react the same in every AutoCAD-based program. So the annotative text, dimensions, hatch patterns, etc. that I'm showing you will react the same in AutoCAD, Civil 3D, AutoCAD LT, AutoCAD Electrical, anything that's AutoCAD-based. Now, having said that, some of these other programs have their own version of an annotative object. So you mentioned Civil 3D, and that's a great question. Civil 3D styles for objects are automatically set up for annotative, like the label styles. They react similarly to this, but they don't react quite the same way. So when you're using something like Civil 3D annotation, you don't want to set Civil 3D annotation up with an annotative text style, because Civil 3D annotation automatically does all of that inside the label style. Civil 3D annotation or the labels inside of Civil 3D don't have the multiple grips like I showed you here. You move one piece of Civil 3D label or one Civil 3D label, it's going to move everywhere in every viewport. But, you know, it's got some pros and cons. It reacts to viewport twisting a little bit differently than the AutoCAD annotation does, and it works real easy. It automatically self-scales regardless of your scale factor, regardless of how many annotation scales you're plugging in. So there are pros and cons. So just understand that the annotative objects will work the same in any flavor of AutoCAD. However, those different flavors may have something in addition to or a little bit different from this. All right, and we are coming up to our end point here. Are there any other questions, anything that I can answer quickly?
Again, if you haven't asked any questions through the presentation, feel free to type them in on your side here. We will respond to them as the last few minutes of our webinar wrapping up, and something we do need to reach out to separately. We will send you a private message and let you know.
And I see one other question from Dwayne, annotative scaling and masking. And I'm assuming, Dwayne, you're asking about like the text mask for annotative scalings. The text mask works the same way. Let me stretch this little guy in here. So text masking works the same way that it pretty much does anywhere. I can use a background mask and my drawing scale color. And what masking is that when I grab this guy and move it over top of something else, you'll notice that it masks it. And then that's the size of the text box. Now if I come in here and I change to, say, 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, you're going to notice that I've got a separate text box for the 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. So you've got to be careful. And now if I change it to 3/16, you'll notice that I go back to the same text box. So the text masking works very similar to the grips. When you think about text, and especially M text, you're not really just looking at one grip, you're looking at multiple grips. And inside of annotative scaling, all of those grips work on a scale-by-scale basis. So that's another very good question.
Time for a few more?
One or two more?
All right. How do annotative scales play with dynamic blocks? For an example, can there be different states of the dynamic block for different annotation scales?
Wow, that's a really good question. You've got to be careful with annotative scaling inside of dynamic blocks. If your dynamic block has text in it and you want your dynamic block to be annotatively scaled, then you shouldn't use an annotative text style inside of an annotative block. Use a standard text style inside of there. Now, as far as different states of the dynamic blocks, then that could be a very interesting proposal. Always remember that the annotative scaling will react to your grips and how the grips work, and that grip position is going to be different on a scale-by-scale factor. If you introduce the multiple grips and the sizing grips on a scale-by-scale factor of an annotative object, that you may be able to do exactly what I'm showing you here. I've not tested that out, to be quite honest, to see how those grips can react on an annotative block inside of a dynamic block. So the best thing that I could recommend is that it's very similar to what we were looking at for text. What I would assume is that all of the grips are going to be separate on a scale-by-scale factor. So that would be one of those where, depending on what it is you want to do, you're going to want to test that out and see how it reacts on each one of the scale factors. My base assumption is that the grips are going to be managed with that dynamic block on the scale, so it doesn't go zooming off into space, and each scale factor will have its own set of grips. Having said that, like I said, want to throw the caveat, I've never tried it.
Can M.Techs wrap differently at different scales?
Yeah, as I was just showing you, Joe, right here for the M.Techs wrap, each one of them, pull that guy out, is different on a scale-by-scale basis. All right, and with that, we are going to have to wrap up. We've run out of time, so I'd like to thank everybody for showing up here. Hopefully, you picked up one or two things for annotative scaling, and if you're not using annotative scaling, start using it. I think one of the big reasons that people haven't been using annotative scaling is because it's very complex, cumbersome, they're scared of it, it does weird things. Hopefully I was able to shed a little light on that, peel back some of the scariness of annotative scaling. Try one thing at a time. Try a text style. Make it annotative. Plug in your text. See how it acts. Don't try to do it all at once. Pick one thing at a time. Get used to it, and then migrate all of those ideas over to things like dimensions and then hatching, etc. Try it out. But before too long, once you get this set up and once you get it plugged into a template, I can guarantee you you're probably not going to want to go back.
So everyone, as you see, we have lots of ways we'd love to reach out to you. So follow us on our Facebook page, get on active on our Twitter page. We have a great Civil 3D Plus blog that one of our instructors run. It's a great way to follow some more in-depth information on Civil 3D. And again, just anytime you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. We have lots of training classes coming up. We're still the top training center here, and as far as I know, the U.S.
Top training center in North America, as far as we know, for the last couple of years running. We have not gotten any kind of notification for awards, but for anybody who has not heard, the last couple of years running, we're the top training center based on customer feedback, based on student feedback in all of North America. So that's from the students. That's not just some random thing like the Oscars or something like that.
Yeah,
I have no idea who's voting on it.
So we have lots of resources here at CAD 1. So feel free to reach out to us if there's a pilot project you're taking on and you're moving into, you need some additional help, just some over-the-shoulder hand-holding type implementation, or if a full-on training class here at your office for just as an individual or for a group. We have lots of different ways to expand the education level of your applications for AutoCAD and just about any other Autodesk related product. So feel free to reach out to us, give us a call.
And for the implementation part of it, a lot of people who are looking at adopting something as cumbersome as annotative scaling, using sheet sets, things like that, we're working with a lot of different companies on doing implementations like that. So if you need a little bit of help, if you've got questions, like Lawrence said, reach out to us. We're working with a lot of different companies, and we help people out all the time getting you rolling with all of this.
Help you move through the project and kind of get back to work, and so we're not bottlenecked and doesn't slow your progress of your project. So again, reach out to us at any time.
With that, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. Keep your eyes open for more webinars coming in the future, and we'd love to see you join us.
Thank you.